It was the autumn of 1912 when Robert Collins arrived in the sleepy village of East Grange, situated far from the noise of London. A young journalist with an unshakable thirst for rationality, he had become obsessed with a story that had long intrigued him: the mystery of Windmill House. The locals, with their hushed tones and wary glances, told him it was haunted by the spirit of Edward Grayson, the last occupant who had vanished over 30 years ago. But Robert wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or superstitions. No, he was here for the story, the truth that could debunk the legends once and for all. Windmill House stood like a monument to forgotten history. Its windows were dark, covered in grime and neglect, but the house itself felt alive, a watchful, silent entity that had stood for generations. There were whispers about Grayson's obsession with life after death, his late-night experiments with spiritualism, and how he had driven himself into madness. But Robert wasn't deterred. Rational thinking would guide him. He would find the truth. The villagers warned him. "It's not the house," an old woman had said. "It's the mind you must fear, young man." But Robert smiled politely and ignored her words. He had seen his fair share of creepy stories. This one would be no different. Robert entered the house as the sun set, a chill creeping in with the dusk. The air was thick with dust and damp, every floorboard creaking beneath his feet as if the house itself was protesting his presence. The silence was suffocating, too quiet, too still. He moved from room to room, the walls seeming to close in around him, until he found what he was looking for: Edward Grayson's study. The study was exactly how he had imagined it: cluttered, dusty, and filled with old, leather-bound books. On the desk lay a journal, its pages yellowed with age, waiting for someone to open it. With a mix of excitement and dread, Robert flipped it open. The entries were rambling at first, describing Grayson's fascination with life after death. As Robert read deeper, the entries grew darker, more frantic. It became clear that Grayson was no longer searching for answers. He was running from something. One particular entry, dated the night of his disappearance, sent a shiver down Robert's spine. "They are here, the voices. At midnight, they arrive, silent, like shadows, their eyes hollow, their whispers cold. I have failed. I sought to cross the barrier, to commune with them, but now they are everywhere. I am their prisoner. I fear I will join them soon." Robert's breath caught in his throat. Was this the madness of a man who had lost his grip on reality? Or was there something more to Grayson's words? Suddenly, the room grew colder, the faintest whisper drifting through the air, as if the words themselves were alive. Robert, he froze, his blood turning to ice. The whisper was faint at first, like a breath against his ear, but it was there. The air in the room seemed to thicken, like invisible hands were closing in on him. Panic surged in his chest. He turned, expecting to find someone or something behind him, but there was nothing. The room was empty. Still, the whisper lingered. "Robert." A strange tension took over the room. Robert tried the door to the study, but it wouldn't open. The air became suffocating. The walls seemed to pulse, and a sensation of being trapped filled him. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the walls, but inside, it was unnervingly still. His breath grew shallow as the temperature continued to drop. The whispers grew louder, now coming from all around him, surrounding him like a swarm of unseen voices. They weren't just words anymore. They were commands. He could feel them pushing into his mind, invading his thoughts. "Robert, you are not alone." The walls of the house seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding as though they were alive, pulsating in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The shadows grew deeper, stretching out across the room, curling into twisted shapes, as if they were aware of him, watching him. Robert's grip on reality began to falter. He felt the world shifting, like the very fabric of time and space was tearing at the seams. His thoughts became disjointed. Memories of his childhood, of his parents, even of his city, began to blur into fragmented images. His legs shook, his hands trembled. The whispers no longer sounded like distant voices. They were inside his head. "We have been waiting for you, Robert." He staggered backward, tripping over the debris of forgotten furniture, his mind spiraling out of control. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs refused to move. The shadows in the room reached out toward him, as if calling him into their depths. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes watching him, feeling him, knowing him. Suddenly, the door creaked open. A figure stood in the doorway, a tall, gaunt figure, pale and hollow-eyed. It was Grayson, or rather, the shell of him. His face was twisted in agony, his mouth moving, but the words didn't make sense. Open the door. You are not meant to leave." Robert stumbled backward, his chest tight with fear. The figure advanced, its hollow eyes locked onto him, its mouth still moving, muttering incoherently. Grayson's voice was now a low, guttural whisper that filled the room. "The voices, they never stop. We never stop. You will stay with us." In a blind panic, Robert turned and ran, the darkness swallowing him whole. He ran through the corridors, past empty rooms, down creaking staircases, but the house was endless. Every door led to another hallway. Every window was a reflection of the same scene. It was as though the house was stretching, pulling him deeper, keeping him trapped. Finally, he reached the front door, but it would not open. His hands, shaking uncontrollably, turned the handle again and again, but it was stuck. The whispers surrounded him, pressing in on all sides. "You cannot leave, Robert." With a cry of desperation, Robert wrenched the door open. But what lay outside was not the village he had known. It was a swirling void, endless and black. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no way back. The last thing he heard was Grayson's voice, echoing in the empty space around him. "Welcome to eternity." The next morning, the villagers found the manor silent once again. Robert Collins was gone. His belongings were left behind, but there was no sign of him. The house stood, as it always had, a monument to forgotten history, its walls whispering their secrets to anyone who dared listen. Years later, the villagers would speak of a new voice that had begun to haunt the house, one that called out, night after night, with a chilling whisper, "Robert." And on the darkest of nights, if one stood near the house, they could hear the faintest sound, a soft rustling in the wind, the sound of footsteps, and the whisper of a name carried on the air. It had been over a year since Robert Collins had disappeared from Windmill House. The village of East Grange had nearly forgotten him, or so it seemed. Life in the village moved on, but a whisper remained, a lingering chill that never truly left. The house, still standing, had only grown more dilapidated, its dark windows like empty eyes, staring into the hearts of those who dared look. But on a cold November evening, a figure arrived in East Grange, Detective Inspector James Harrow, a man known for his sharp mind and skepticism. He had heard of Robert's disappearance, the story of the haunted house, and how the once promising journalist had been swallowed by the darkness. Harrow was not a man of superstition. His world was one of evidence and logic. Yet, the circumstances of Robert's disappearance troubled him, and he was determined to uncover the truth. The villagers had warned him. They spoke in hushed tones of the curse, of the voices that called to those who entered the house. But Harrow dismissed it all. In his mind, the truth was waiting to be found, hidden within the walls of Windmill House. A rational explanation, Missing documents, perhaps, or a tragic fall. He made his way to the house at twilight, the air thick with fog. The manor stood before him, its silhouette haunting in the low light, its once grand facade now crumbling and consumed by neglect. Harrow stood at the threshold, his hand hovering over the rusted door handle, but he hesitated. A chill ran down his spine, an irrational shiver that he quickly shook off. He wasn't afraid. The door creaked open, as if it had been waiting for him. As he stepped inside, the smell of decay and mildew hit him. He knew the house had been abandoned for years, but it still felt alive. The stillness, the air that seemed to hold its breath, made his every step feel like an intrusion. He walked through the decaying halls, the oppressive silence pressing in on him. The house felt as though it were watching, its dark corners alive with a presence. But Harrow, ever the skeptic, remained focused. He reached the study, the room where Robert had last been seen. The desk was still there, covered in dust, the chair tipped over as though it had been abandoned in haste. And then Harrow saw it, a small, leather-bound journal, half hidden under the pile of papers. His heart raced as he opened it, his eyes scanning the pages. It was Robert's journal. He had written right up until his disappearance. The entries were scattered, frantic. Robert's handwriting grew more erratic as the days passed, speaking of strange noises, of voices that whispered in the darkness, of shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Harrow's eyes widened as he read the final entry, written just before Robert vanished. They are not ghosts, not shadows, not echoes of the dead. There's something else, something older, something darker. I have seen them, felt them. They are real, and they are not waiting for me to leave. They want me to stay, and when I do, they will take me. The words hit Harrow with a force he hadn't expected. He felt a shift in the air, like something had changed. A weight pressed down on his chest. The house, it wasn't just abandoned. It was waiting for someone to come back. Harrow was not easily shaken, but as the hours passed, something began to gnaw at him. The house was too still, too quiet, and yet he could feel it, the sense of something unseen moving just beyond his perception. The longer he stayed, the more oppressive it became. His every step seemed to echo in the silence, too loud, too desperate. The whispers began. At first, they were subtle, low murmurs, too quiet to understand. But then they grew louder, closer. Harrow stopped dead in his tracks. His heart pounded in his chest as his breath quickened. Harrow. It was his name, whispered in a voice so soft, it felt like a caress. He spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers continued, now coming from all sides. He couldn't ignore them. Harrow, you know the truth. His pulse quickened. The room began to close in on him. The air grew thick, heavy with a suffocating presence. He backed away, his hand reaching for the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. Panic set in. He turned to the windows, but they too were sealed, locked, impossible to open. The whispers now filled the entire room. They were no longer soft or distant. They were clear, sharp, insistent. We have waited for you. Harrow's head spun. He felt himself losing control, his mind unraveling as the whispers grew into a roar. They were not just voices, they were thoughts, fears, memories that were not his own. He heard them all at once, the cacophony overwhelming him. You will stay, just like him, just like Robert. The room seemed to stretch, warping around him, the walls bending inward. The shadows writhed, twisting like living things, reaching for him. He could hear his own breathing, heavy and erratic, yet it felt distant, as if it wasn't his own. His vision blurred, his thoughts fragmented. He couldn't think straight. Was this what Robert had felt? Was this what had driven him mad? A figure appeared at the edge of his vision, a tall, gaunt man, his face pale and twisted. It was Grayson, or what was left of him. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets, and his mouth moved as though speaking words Harrow could not hear. Harrow stepped back, his legs shaking beneath him. The figure took a step forward, its presence suffocating. Harrow could feel the air growing heavier, thick with the weight of it. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth opened, but the whispers drowned everything out. "You are not leaving." Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his chest, as if the very house itself had pierced him. He stumbled, his vision going dark at the edges. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the figure's hollow eyes, staring into his soul. When Harrow awoke, he was no longer in the study. He was in a different room, dark, damp, and cold. His head throbbed, and he could barely focus. The house had changed. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and the air was thick with an oppressive force. He tried to stand, but his body felt heavy, as though something was holding him down. He looked around, his eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. Then he saw it. There, in the corner of the room, a figure. Robert Collins, or at least what was left of him. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at Harrow with an intensity that was both terrified and vacant. "It's too late," Robert whispered, his voice hollow. "You crossed the line. The house, it doesn't let go." Harrow tried to speak, but no words came. His breath came in ragged gasps as the house pressed in on him, the shadows stretching and growing. The whispers surrounded him, louder now, feeding off his fear. "It's too late. We're all trapped now." The figure of Robert took a step forward, his body contorted unnaturally, and Harrow's heart pounded. He was not in control anymore. The house had taken him, just like it had taken Robert. The last thing he heard, before the darkness consumed him completely, was the whisper, "Welcome to eternity."